And here you've got a classical example how a bastion of liberal democracy, which is Canada, is basically doing the same things that totalitarian governments are doing, right? Hello and good evening, everybody, and good morning to those in Canada. I think it's 9 a.m. in Vancouver, if I'm not mistaken. Today I'm joined again by Ray McGinnis, and he's been covering the scandal that broke out since the trucker protest in Canada. He was covering the propaganda of that earlier, and then we did an episode on the scandal that was the public hearings and the commission of inquiry that, sort of protected the government. But today I think we're going to talk about a topic that is much deeper that people shouldn't forget about. And this is the fact that there's 4 people in Canada that have been denied bail, that are in prison. And as I understand it, Ray, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, they don't know the charges yet. Is that correct?
Well, they do know their charges. They are charged. They were arrested variously on the night of the 13th of February 2022, and by noon of the 14th on mischief over $5,000. And later on that day, just before the Emergencies Act was invoked by the Prime Minister, they were charged with conspiracy to commit murder. They were all unarmed when they were arrested, and they have no trial date at this point, 549 days and counting. They also have been denied bail, although many people, it's almost unheard of to not be granted bail for a price, maybe with conditions of a ankle bracelet or something like that, first-degree murder charges, manslaughter, and so on. Off they go. Shoot a police officer in Toronto, and Bob's your uncle. The next day, you're out on bail. However, these 4 are not granted bail. They're also not in jail. They're in a remand center, so they're in a setting which normally is just like a transition point on the way to some other place, and not really meant for constant housing for over a year and a half. So it goes against the principles of people are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, and they're also supposed to be able to have, since the Magna Carta and before that, right to a timely trial, so that people who are accused of a crime can answer their accusers and defend themselves in court.
So this is like breaking all the rules of Magna Carta, habeas corpus, the Kafka arrest, all those cliche legal hearings you're basically arguing.
Yes, I mean, and I was surprised to find out that this tradition in Western democracies goes back pre-Magna Carta to 1166 with the, I think it's called the Assize of Clarendon under Henry II in 1166, where he said, people who are charged can't just be left to rot in jail, or they need to be able to answer their accusers. Otherwise, you have a society where all that's required is somebody in a position of authority accuses someone of a crime, puts them in jail, and just leaves them there.
Yeah, and this is, before we get into the details of the case, this is the hypocrisy that people in the developing world often throw back at the Western governments. They make it so easy for them, or in totalitarian governments. So again, my wife's Iranian, and I've got lots of friends who are Zimbabwe, and they throw you in jail and they throw the key away, and it's sort of a kangaroo court type of justice sometimes. And we always say, well, at least we're not like them. And here you've got a classical example how a bastion of liberal democracy, which is Canada, is basically doing the same things that totalitarian governments are doing, right?
And it's very concerning, because this whole very alarming story of 4. I mean, they're charged with this crime, and if people are found guilty of a crime of plotting to commit murder of our Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers, then they should stay in jail for a long time. And yet, this is not, we're not supposed to be operating justice where you presume people guilty until proven innocent. Right. But it seems that there's been one of them. It's very ponderous, even it costs quite a lot of money, legal, employing lawyers and so on, to get all the documentation in place, even to make a request to grant bail. And one judge, one of these 4, was being represented by their lawyer to the judge in question back in, I think, the spring of 2022 to grant bail. And the justice basically didn't even want to look at the documentation, sort of waved it away and said, no, I basically know this person's guilty, so I'm not going to grant them bail. And that's
Wow.
also a surprise, because normally a judge should at least look at the documentation and see what the case is for granting someone bail.
So this is shocking. I mean, you'd think that at least, I mean, it just shows the total failure of the legal system to be an adjudicator, right? That's its job in its most basic form. Can you maybe give us just a sense, who are these people, the four of them? Because obviously they've got families, and they've got real jobs and real faces behind them.
They're four men who live in southern Alberta. Variously, there's Chris Carbert, who's 42 years old. He's a single father. He had been raising. He kind of won a custody battle, I guess, and was raising his son. His son was just 9 months old when Chris Carbert got custody, and has been with him constantly. Except for being charged and then sent, put in his own custody in
Right.
the and so and he's been he's been working as a landscaper and with a fencing business, and had 9 employees. And then you have he had a high school chum named Chris Lysek, who's an electrician. So the two of them knew each other before they arrived in the small border town of Coutts, Coutts, Alberta, across from Sweetgrass, Montana. And then you have 2 other people, Jerry Morin, who's 41 years old. He's a lineman, so he fixes telephone lines all over the place. And then Tony Oleanic, who's has a gravel truck and is self-employed, and helped with a cleanup after a huge flood in the town of High River, Alberta, to the west of where Coutts is. So I mean, they all have jobs. Between the 4 of them, 3 of them are fathers. So they have 7 children. They're all known in the community. One of them, Chris Carbert, was reported in the press to have been arrested for assaulting a police assault. But it actually was a situation where, in his late teens, I think 19 or 20, he basically, somebody picked a fight with him in a bar, and he fought back, and then he was given a conditional sentence. Right. Which is different. So, and then aside from that, I mean, I think he also, once was getting some ecstasy for somebody, in his late teens. Made a mistake.
I mean, that is not something that would have been. I mean, that's something many of my friends would have gotten up to easily, and they probably got away with it. So it's nothing. Yeah. It's nothing that just. I mean, nothing would justify this, even if they were criminals, right?
Yeah.
So can you maybe just give a quick Reader's Digest version of how these 4 men got into trouble again?
So they're in a setting, and what I mean, we have the notable convoy of many miles and kilometers of trucks going from the West Coast, Pacific Coast, and the Atlantic Coast to Ottawa. And while that was rolling along, and once people got to Ottawa, other supportive groups got together in near the Vancouver, Washington state border, near on a little border town called Emerson in Manitoba, near Minnesota, and a couple of places, Windsor, Detroit, Ambassador Bridge, and a few other places in Ontario. And then there was Coutts in Alberta, and so there were people who just spontaneously, mostly it was a farmer protest, not so much a trucker protest, although some of the farmers, there were some trucks there too, but there was as many farm machinery vehicles as there were trucks in Coutts. And already by the 1st of February, just days into the protest at the Coutts blockade, the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, got on the news, did a press conference, and he scolded the Coutts protesters. He said he was shocked and outraged that there were protesters who had assaulted a police officer in Coutts, and that this kind of thing cannot be tolerated. And I mean, I didn't watch that press conference until very recently when I wrote my article, but I would have agreed. Don't assault police officers. Except somebody followed up with a guy who was a corporal, RCMP Corporal Curtis Peters, and asked him later on, did any protester assault an RCMP officer or police officer? And Corporal Peters said no. This was actually an incident between two civilians, had nothing to do with assaulting a police officer at all. And so now maybe Jason Kenney was given the wrong information, but the story out there from early in February was that these are violent people down in Coutts. And so you've got police who are down there trying to deal with potentially and allegedly violent protesters. And so you also have, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, said when he testified before the public emergency inquiry in Ottawa back in November, he was asked, when did he first consider invoking the Emergencies Act? And he answered, from the very beginning. So even before the protests arrived in Ottawa, the government was already thinking of find us a way to invoke the Emergencies Act. So
that's the act, if I remember correctly, where Coast Guard's information triggered, as far as we can tell, or something opinion. Like there was no intelligence behind triggering that. The most important acts since World War II in Canada, right?
Yeah, Pat Morris of the Ontario Provincial Police Intelligence Unit testified that he was, quote, shocked by the lack of criminality, and others said the same thing. And it was clear that the city of Ottawa had reached an agreement with the protesters, and by noon on Valentine's Day of 2022, 104 vehicles had moved away, leaving the city, and photos of all the license plates of the said vehicles who had departed, who then didn't need to have a tow truck tow them because they'd left. Those photos were taken by city officials, and the protesters were on schedule, according to the city, to have removed 75% of all the vehicles by the 16th, just 2 days later. So you have the situation where you've got a lot of incendiary comments being made by cabinet officials about children who are with their parents, and the protesters using their children as human shields, and so on. And so the government is getting kind of the window of opportunity to really carry on and maintain that this is a dangerous. The Freedom Convoy protesters across Canada are dangerous, especially if they'd waited until the 16th when 75% of the vehicles have left Ottawa. It's kind of hard, And then also another flashpoint was, there's this blockade on a bridge between Windsor and Detroit, and yet the police and the protesters had reached an agreement over the weekend of the 11th to 13th, and the bridge was cleared and traffic was flowing as usual. So then what you have left finally is suddenly there's this allegation that the RCMP produces on the late morning or early afternoon Alberta time the cache of weapons, and says there's this cache of weapons, and there are people we've arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. Now, when they were arrested, they variously, a couple of them, I think, Tony Oleanic and Chris Lysak were arrested, between 9 and 10 or 10:30 on the night of the 13th, unarmed. And then, Chris Carbert knew about this, Purportedly, the government says these four are involved in a plot to overthrow the government and to start this off by shooting police officers in Coutts. So Chris Carbert, if he was indeed a domestic terrorist, as being alleged, decides not to sort of try and do something nefarious. He decides to go to bed. And then, and is finally he's apprehended, sometime after midnight, the wee small hours of the morning of the 14th February. Meanwhile, Jerry Morin has gone back to Calgary and is, kind of working around, doing his job on the 14th, and he's arrested at noon. Again, not the kind of behavior you would expect if somebody was, ideologically driven to overthrow the government. And their buddies had been arrested that were all part of this plot. I want to add.
I just want to ask something that disturbs me here. You mentioned the word domestic terrorism. Now, South Africa and the UK, I think, were the first countries to have a war on terror, domestic terror. Yeah. Okay, and it became obviously the notorious apartheid government who imprisoned eventually Nelson Mandela as a terrorist. Does Canada have a law that authorizes the government to clamp down on domestic terrorists, assuming they are?
Well, there are laws regarding intruding on funding of terrorism. If you designate somebody as a domestic terrorist, then I think that there are a number of hoops that don't have to be jumped through in terms of for the authorities to double down if there's like an imminent, like someone's trying to shoot the prime minister or something. They'll be able to bypass a number of the protocols you would normally do.
But I mean, assuming you need to have some level of criteria. And I mean, last time we sort of spoke a little bit about this, we said the criteria was not even meant for an emergency. Now I'm looking at the question: did they even meet the criteria as alleged terrorists or something of the sort? I mean, how were they evaluated as terrorists?
Well, that will be interesting to see what the Crown prosecutors put forward as the case to show that they are, indeed were plotting. I want to add that under when the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland was testifying before the commission in Ottawa on November 24th, 2022, there was a notes from her notebook that were put up on a screen. Now, this didn't all go into the transcript, but what she writes in the note is she's writing to someone called Dave or David, and she's writing, we need to sort of change our playbook. You need to designate these people as domestic terrorists. Now she was asked under oath, who was the Dave? What is the surname of Dave who you were wanting to urge to designate these people as domestic terrorists, maybe Freedom Convoy protesters in general or people in Coutts. And she couldn't remember the surname of the Dave in question. It was hard for her to recall. Perhaps she knows many, many people named Dave and also knows many, many people named Dave who would be in positions of authority that could do something around designating domestic terrorists in Canada. But anyway, she said it was not. She did not. She said that she did not meet with David Vigneault, the head of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS.
You'd think it'd be that Dave,
He could be that Dave, and although she protests that she did not meet with him, that would not mean that she wouldn't have been taking notes in a notebook and could have had a phone call with him. Because I want to say, I mean, she's a slippery person. She had earlier.
So was this under oath that she was technically? I don't know.
This is under oath, and I want to say that earlier this year she bragged or boasted that she does not drive a car. And that, of course, gave many Canadians the impression that she walks all the time. She's got a very small carbon footprint. But then it turned out that there were a month's worth of invoices from her chauffeur. that the government had to pay for.
Of course, she doesn't drive, yeah.
It's true. She doesn't own a car and she walks, but she also gets in the back seat of a limousine and then pays a chauffeur through taxpayers' dollars to drive her hither and yon all around.
So she didn't meet with Dave, but she could have talked to Dave.
She could have talked to Dave, yeah. And so it's clear that there's a keen interest on the part of senior government officials to designate people as terrorists because they want to invoke the Emergencies Act. And the Emergencies Act has 4 criteria from the 1988 legislation, which is that there must be espionage, foreign interference, sabotage, serious acts of violence, and plot to overthrow the government. Now, and when the CSIS director David Vigna was testifying, he said, plot to overthrow the government. He said it was so, there was just nothing there to even look at. It was nothing, a nothing burger. And the same with espionage, foreign interference, sabotage. When the Prime Minister, National Security Advisor Jody Thomas was asked about the critical additional criteria, acts of serious violence that are unfolding, she changed out the word serious to continual violence. And she did not refer to people who were armed to storm Parliament buildings. She pointed to there was honking of horns. There were engines running in the streets and there are.
You see, this is the thing. They changed the definition to the point where violence, in my view, is somebody's hitting me. Right. That seems to be at least those physical contact. That's sort of in my head. If you say somebody is violent, this is aggressive, he's threatening me at best. Something like that. And here we are, expanding into cars being hocked and children playing in jumping castles, if I remember correctly.
Yes, the children were in bouncy castles. They were playing with large Lego. They were playing hockey. They were dancing with their parents, the hokey pokey and the Macarena.
Behavior.
And I want to say, I learned. There were thousands of children, especially on the weekend, in strollers and older than that, walking around with their parents. It was not on a daily basis. The police were assessing the situation. At no point did they think that they needed to declare the protest a riot. They never had to invoke the Riot Act or say you have to clear this area within the next half an hour or else we're going to start arresting you, because there was nothing going on that mandated that response.
And has your government in Canada at least come to some admission or at least a statement that maybe they overreacted, that they got this wrong? Or are they still keeping to the same old debunked narrative?
No, they're sticking to this story. And the Prime Minister reluctantly sort of said he was maybe could have chosen some different words than to describe all the protesters who were arriving in Ottawa as an unacceptable fringe minority and racists and hillbillies and insurrectionists and mercenaries. There were a number of epithets tossed at them from a variety of cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister himself. And the Prime Minister and the government's position and municipal, and provincially as well, was to not talk to the protesters. Although it's been the tradition throughout since the founding of Canada that whenever there are protesters anywhere, even in the Great Depression in the 1930s, protesters came from the west, from Regina to Ottawa. And although Prime Minister R.B. Bennett didn't like the protesters, he sat down with them, with 8 of their leaders, and they had
what I remember from political science about Canada is that Canada has had an elite historically who tried to reform before there were protests in a certain way. They preempted the worst and the extremists, and they sort of changed the system to dumb down. That was always what Canadian democracy, what people appreciated about Canada. Yeah. And I think this was one of the first time that with Trudeau he used the same threatening, violent language that you see on the African continent when there's grievances. And I think this is part of the problem. And you're basically saying, if I understand you correctly, is that you cannot understand this, obvious injustice for people being held, 500 days, and we don't even know why they're being held anymore. You cannot understand it without understanding that response of the government, right?
Well, I mean, this particular the arrests of these four and the charges against them are part of an essential justification for invoking the Emergencies Act. And if these four go free, I mean, if they're acquitted, then that will cause a problem it may or may not cause a problem for the government, because the mainstream media in Canada has not been covering this story. I mean, there have been a recent pre-trial motions with lots of with bombshells happening, and you have really nobody in the mainstream media. You have two really independent journalists, one there for the week and one there for a day and a bit, and so really the media has gone AWOL in terms of covering this story. They basically jumped on the bandwagon and described these people as crazy domestic terrorists who want to overthrow the government and shoot police officers, which Canadians and I would agree is a terrible thing to do. But it's easy to make an allegation, and it seems that too many people in my country now are happy for politicians to simply get on their high horse and make accusations and walk away, and then leave these four in jail, and not to really care about the story at all. So.
Yeah. And you, I mean, the first article you wrote about this was on the propaganda that the Canadian government goes in, and the reaction you're describing now by the public, I mean, you would agree with me, I guess, that this is due to the government intentionally using propaganda at the time.
Yes, it's. I mean, it's. If you make a case before the press as a prime minister, or Marco Mendocino as public safety minister, or others, that you have these dangerous people, and you say, look at this photo of this cache of weapons with the RCMP cruiser behind it. And most people in Canada live in an urban setting and maybe don't even own a gun. I don't own a gun. And so I'll look at it, and then I'll try and make meaning of what that must mean. I won't notice that there's bear spray on the table, or that almost every single gun or weapon on the table is something that a person could get a license to own, or that almost all of the guns on the table are actually hunting rifles. I mean, there's no sniper guns here. I mean, you wouldn't. I mean, if it's a pretty poor choice to decide that you're going to take a stand to start overthrowing the government by having four individual men pick up their hunting rifles and start a shootout with RCMP officers when there are over 50 cruisers and like two officers per cruiser. So it's like you got a 4 to 100 ratio. I mean, and they've got.
I mean, not even suicide bombers are that stupid,
No, I mean, it would be hopeless to bother doing that. But if you have the right psychological operation and show that people in this environment, after weeks of stoking fear and apprehension about who these protesters were, mercenaries and everything, this sort of just adds to the cherry on top for people feeling once again anxious, vulnerable, frightened, and a majority of Canadians said, lock them up, throw away the key. They must, people in a nanosecond assume that they must be guilty, and now they're off to having their happy hour.
Wow. On to get back to these four men, what do you think is the most important thing that the public should do, and how can we help? I guess. I mean, I know I sit in a different country, but at least create awareness, things of that sort.
Well, there is a Facebook page called Alberta Politcal Prisoners, and people could visit that page to see what the latest information is. If anybody wants to write any of these four men. The addresses are provided on that Facebook page, and I think that like you want to keep their spirits up, because here they are in unusually long detention, and they've been offered plea deals, I understand, and have refused. They maintain their.
I mean, that's ridiculous as well. Plea to what? They're not guilty. I mean, or at least they've been proven guilty, right? I mean, shouldn't their trial be coming up already? I mean, this is just ridiculous.
Well, there is something called the Jordan Act, which I think after 30 months, it can then be argued that a trial date is, excuse me, has lingered too long, and then maybe they could just go free and the whole case is thrown out. But they want to have their day in court, because if they don't have a day in court, if it happens that it goes 30, 35 months, and then they finally get let go because the judge says it's been too long, then they're not convicted, but they're not acquitted. They're just simply were charged, and then the charges were dropped because of this circumstance of taking too long to go to trial. Well, then you have the possibility that what will happen for these four is not that people will say, oh, well, they weren't guilty. You can have people writing op-eds and columns in the papers and on the TV stations shaking their heads about, isn't it terrible about Canadian justice and how we can't get people who are certainly guilty of terrible crimes to trial to convict them. So they could still be convicted in the public media markets, and so they would live their lives being regarded as terrible people that
I mean, you're really breaking my faith in the justice system, by doing it this way. You're saying people, the government doesn't have a case against them, as I understand you. The government's dragging us out, and then there's still the possibility that the media can attack them afterwards, even though they've never been charged for anything. If I understand you correctly.
Well, they've been charged with conspiracy to commit murder. They've been charged with weapons possession and mischief over $5,000. But the case that the Crown has seems to be not that solid. And the Crown's behavior. I mean, there was going to be a trial. They were going to go to trial in mid-June of 2023. And then just before that happened, the Crown dropped on the defense over 3,000 or more pages of documents, which you wouldn't want to do if you felt you had a solid case to go to trial, because then the defense has to ask for a delay, goes through all kinds of documents, finds what's called inadvertent disclosure of information regarding testimony of some RCMP officers that may be, if I'm correct, exculpatory evidence that perhaps these men are innocent and not guilty. I mean, and so what has happened with the pre-trial motions now in late June, the defense made a criminal code 1 application to the judge regarding the conduct of one or more of the Crown prosecutors, which would mean then that in the conduct of exploring the case, investigating the case on the part of the Crown, that they have been advising witnesses, advising maybe police officers in ways that reveal criminal code violations on the part of the Crown and gross misconduct. So there's there's a lot that's so now you have one or more Crown prosecutors who may end up in the course of this or in the course of some other trial down the road being defendants to defend charges of crime fraud and gross misconduct.
Yeah. This is really a tragedy of the thing. So you say the public can write to these men, they can support them. Do they have legal support at the moment? Do they have a team that's who's defending them at the moment?
They each have their own unique legal assistance. Two of them have legal aid because they can only afford legal aid. and legal aid. You've got people that have limited amount of time to support them. Two of them have been able to hire lawyers. But again, you've got, and they're working as hard as they can. But when you've got the Crown prosecution dumping thousands, and surely could have provided the defense many, many months before. They're going through. It's almost like the process.
It's difficult when the state goes against you because they have the wallet basically, and they can throw so many accusations, and it's so difficult to prove yourself innocent against all those things. It's a very difficult situation they faced. This is what they call sort of judicial realism. It's when the public opinion is against you and the government's against you, and I think the government has no difficulty making their argument in the media at this stage, given the amount of propaganda that went into this thing. And these poor folks have to get, you say, lawyers that don't work for the best money in the world, right?
Yeah, and when you've got this cache of weapons, which is displayed, which people assume is a kind of a slam dunk of being able to point and say, see, they must be guilty, but yet you've got the whole way that these weapons were, like they were taken from someplace, some of them brought into a woman named Joanne Person's home, and then taken somewhere else to put in this display. It's alleged by public statements by the RCMP on the 14th, and a few days later, in mid-February of 2022, that there were other unknown persons who were directing the four from somewhere else. Now, there's a Toronto police detective and sergeant named Donald Best, who looked at all of this. He's retired now, and he said, if you believe that there are other persons who are involved that we don't yet know, you would take care of these weapons. But what they've done is they didn't bag the weapons, they didn't do fingerprinting or DNA. They just sort of put them up on a display on a table in a precarious way. Whereas if somebody just accidentally bumped the table, you could have a whole bunch of guns fall to the floor. It's not the whole display of those.
So you would argue the link between these cache of weapons and them is very poor at the moment. I mean, there's no fingerprint, there's no evidence. They have even DNA evidence. I mean, I don't even know how it works exactly. But you would make the argument based on what you know at the moment. It seems like it's set up basically. It
seems from listening to this former sergeant and detective, that the whole manner of the sloppiness of handling these weapons. Even if any of these weapons, almost all of which could be obtained legally through a gun license, if any of them do happen to be connected to any of these four, that none of them, in the way that they've been sloppily handled, could even be entered as evidence in the trial. So it's again, the whole thing is not being conducted in a way that you would want to conduct it. Compared to there was a shooter, a guy who shot multiple, I think dozens of people in Nova Scotia a few years ago. In that case, the RCMP took many months before they would even show the press a single weapon. That's because they were trying to maintain the safety of the evidence. But here you have all of a sudden, within hours of the final arrest, up goes this big display where people can read into it what they want.
Wow. Okay, that's shocking as well. Is there any other detail you want to add to us that you think is important to highlight about this case?
Well, I mean, on the 28th of July, after my article was published, during the pretrial motions, the RCMP Chief Superintendent Kevin Kunetsky said that the RCMP had also been looking at who might have been behind this plot, and they were thinking that maybe it was the Netherlands Reformed Church in the city of Fort Macleod, Alberta, which when that came out, I'm sure that all the people on the board of that congregation were quite surprised that the RCMP thought that there would be that maybe their congregation, I don't know how many people on the board would have put their hands up and said, yes, let's overthrow the government, and some others said, no, let's pray about it.
Did the church take a formal position against the trucker mandate? I mean, I'm trying to figure out what the link would be.
Well, I mean, as I understand it, there were more people in the congregation that were actually against the protests than were for it. But nonetheless, there you go. It seems that the RCMP. You've also got undercover RCMP officers who are sidling up to these four men and starting conversations like proposing themselves as gun enthusiasts. Like how many weapons do you think are just in this area? Perhaps would be a question, and then maybe someone says hundreds or thousands, and then they'll take that soundbite. They didn't record it; they just asked the questions, and then claim that somebody said something, and then make that try and frame a case against them. I mean, also these women were, I understand, very young, very sexy and attractive, perhaps flirtatious, and presented themselves as far right, maybe pro-Trump supporters, perhaps, although they're in Canada. In any event, it seems that there was, as well, I want to say that it's clear that there, in addition to the whole operation of responding to the Coutts blockade by the RCMP, for decades, the RCMP has had command response protocols that they adhere to. But in this particular case, they threw all of that out the window, and all of the local RCMP were dealing with a whole brand new set of protocols and a whole new system to try and learn quickly and to try and understand. There was some confusion, and there was also apparently surprise, whether this can be believed or not, surprised by local RCMP that there were also federal RCMP from Ottawa who were also on the ground doing things. So it seems that
this is so excessive in response to this. I mean, I'm still shocked that Canada have gone this far. You say they're basically acting as if the country is being infiltrated. I mean, this is what they're using, right? It's propaganda techniques. It's planting RCMP guys here and there. It's just going overboard over these protesters. They cannot come around to say, guys, we got this wrong. I think that's the big issue here.
The mayor of Coutts, Jimmy Willett, testified at the Public Order Emergency Commission in Ottawa back in the fall, and he was talking to people in the press, I think CTV, kind of in not to the press, but in text messages or emails saying that all the protesters in general in Coutts, days before these four were arrested, were domestic terrorists, quote unquote, and he also said that his wife had seen a hockey bag that she was certain contained guns and weapons, which is a really strange thing to think. I mean, if I looked at a hockey bag from some distance, I'd be hard pressed to be able to distinguish whether or not there were hockey sticks in the bag or if there were guns. It's hard to know that. But in any event, these are the kind of statements made. There's also reports, a woman named Joanne Person, who's been interviewed on the Good Morning with Jason podcasts recently, said that there were some reports by protesters noticing that there were Canada Border Service agents together with RCMP trading a hockey bag or two. And what that has to do with the other allegations regarding a hockey bag with guns, I can't be sure. But there's a lot of loose ends and a lot that will be very interesting to find out if this case goes to trial.
Okay, and are you optimistic that if the case goes to trial, and you say it can be anywhere now until I work now about 30 months or 600 days, if I'm not mistaken, 900 days, so they still have 400 days more or less left. Yeah. Are you optimistic there will be some form of justice or some exposure to this whole thing?
Well, I think it's getting more attention, and I think that they're on the edges of the alternative press. There's one story out in Newsweek in the USA, a short editorial. But the other thing is that there's been a publication ban, and the publication ban is really on the contents of information to obtain requests by the RCMP and or the Crown, which I can't speak about because I don't know the contents because it's not available. However, because there's a publication ban, it's been shifted on the part of some media, maybe out of a great abundance of caution, or because they don't want to cover the story, to say that there's a ban on discussing this case completely, which is not the case at all.
So they're stretching the definitions again of secrecy. This is so classical behavior of government.
Yeah. So I mean, but I think that there is more coverage that's happening, more coverage happening internationally than in Canada itself. And I think that it's and the more attention to social media. So I think that I mean, I would think that there's the defense will have a good case for acquittal. I mean, and then again, I mean, no one can know if there's something that the Crown prosecution has that's a trump card of some sort. But there's a lot of things that have happened so far that are calling into question how solid this case is. And so it seems that the process of keeping them in jail, keeping them in custody, is the punishment that they want to met out, even if they'll never go to jail for a long time.
Well, have you contacted personally these four men? Have you been in contact with them, or?
I have recently finally written to each of the four, and I know that they are actually getting quite a bit of mail. I don't know what quite a bit is. So when if I get a response, a letter back, or if I get a phone call, I'll certainly that will certainly inform me going forward.
Well, Ray, I'd like to say to everyone listening here to please read your article. It's a very important article. I mean, this is so important that people should not be held against, for a crime they didn't commit, or justice shouldn't be stretched out, if assuming we're wrong even. Yeah. And I would say to those listening, because my listeners tend to be France and South Africa, is like, speak about it and speak to our government so they can put pressure on the Canadian government to, let justice go its way, if you will. Let this go to court. I mean, that's basically what we're saying. You're basically saying that if these guys come in front of a proper judge and the thing is not loaded against them, they'll win their case, right?
Yeah, I mean, if they should be able to be granted bail, and I mean, they are not flight risks, but you can put them in an ankle bracelet, and the authorities have a way of monitoring anybody who is out on bail, regardless of how serious the charges are. So, these men want to see their children, and so I think
are they allowed access to their children at the moment?
No, I don't. I know that they can be visited under quite limited conditions. I don't know if any of their children have actually visited them or not. I can find out, but it's. I mean, they are in custody in this way. They have not been able to go outdoors for 549 days.
I can't imagine being like that. Well, I would say just because we're running in Indian time to people listening here, just again, speak about this case, try and create awareness of it, share to your friends. I don't know how to get the word out. And then to those in Canada in particular, I mean, if you're in a position of influence or authority, try and get your government to say, look, say to your representatives, this is not on, right? I mean, the things of that sort. You said right to them. I mean, is there anything else we can do for them? I mean, I suppose is there a fundraiser going on as well, or anything of that sort?
Yes, there are fundraisers, and again, if you go to the Alberta Political Prisoners Facebook page, you'll find information about that as well. I can't go to they have things like car rallies and other things that are happening locally, but those of us that don't live in southern Alberta or outside of Canada can't go to those specific events. But we can certainly write them a letter. You can let people in your own governments know. Write to the Canadian embassy or whatever, and raise the question of trying to restore kind of a post Magna Carta Canada, so
Right.
that I mean, if and I gather that there are dozens of other people who are being held in detention in Canada who are also in this position, and
Right.
and I don't know the whole extent of it, but I can say that whatever people think about this case and whether they think that they're guilty or innocent, they should go to trial. And also, if they don't go to trial in a timely manner and they end up going over 30 months, we do not want this to become part of a building precedent where it becomes more and more the norm, where people are simply arrested in Canada, charged of serious crimes, and then never get to go to jail. I mean, never
Right.
get to go to trial.
And I think that is the ultimate point here. This is not just about. I mean, it's obviously about these four men who want to see their family again, but it's more about a broader case of justice. That habeas corpus, Magna Carta, all these legal things I was supposed to learn in school is restored, right? So we can have a democratic order, basically.
Yeah, and so for citizens in general. We may talk about or may have had conversations with friends over cocktail parties and dinners and strolls, and we might talk about how much we love democracy and whatever we say. But when the rubber hits the road and this kind of a situation happens, that's where people have to stand up. Otherwise, all of our talk is just we're like courtiers to power, and we don't really care so much about democracy as much as we want to be see which way the wind is blowing, even if it was blowing in an authoritarian direction.
Right. Well, Ray McGinnis, thank you very much again for this conversation, for the others you've had, and please continue covering this story. You're doing an excellent job, as a citizen journalist. So thank you very much for coming to the channel.
Great, Hugo. Great to speak with you.